Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. This show is made possible by the McPherson Tax Defense Group, 1-800-BEAT-IRS, beatirs.com. That's B-E-A-T, IRS, serving Alaskans Americans since 1978 with 2 generations of tax defense attorneys. We're honored to have with us Jim Simpson. He's been on this program before. He's an investigative journalist, has had pieces published at Breitbart, Washington Times, the Daily Caller, Accuracy in Media, WND, PJ Media, and, of course, RestoringLiberty.com. He's an economist, businessman, has worked as a staff member in the White House Office of Management and Budget, OMB. He was also featured in the Agenda documentary, and now the new Agenda 2 documentary, has written extensively on the refugee issue, has talked about it on this show before. Jim, welcome to the Joe Miller Show. Thank you for coming back to talk more about the refugee problem.
Hey, Joe. Great to be back.
So the Daily Caller article was written about you recently, interview that you had with Jenny Thomas, discusses basically your conclusion that Obama's open border policies reveal that he's more interested in power than protecting Americans. Let's first talk briefly about why you're calling Obama's immigration policy as an open borders issue. You don't believe he's actually deporting more people than anybody's deported before, as he claims? You're laughing.
I look at those statistics. He's deporting fewer people than anybody else. I don't have the exact numbers right in front of me, but we used to deport over 1 million people a year. And you reflect on that figure. If we're deporting that many who get snagged at the border, how many are getting through? Well, he's deporting about half that number now. I don't have the exact figures, but I've looked at them. He's not. But it's inconsistent with everything he does, which is to say, every time he moves his mouth, he's lying.
Yeah, I mean, you look at what he's doing with customs. I mean, there are a number of lawsuits ongoing right now because he's actually directed that Border Patrol officers not do what they're charged with doing under the law. And it's resulted in harm to some of our agents. Tell us what the power linkage is here.
Well, in what sense? Who's associated with this, or what the goals are?
So, I mean, is it all driven by getting new voters, Obama voters, or new Democratic Party voters? I mean, is that the main drive?
Well, that's a big part of the drive for certain. Whenever the left does something, it usually is for a multitude of purposes. That the illegal alien, open borders agenda, a refugee resettlement agenda for that matter, they all serve all of the left's strategies. One, and it's a big one, and it's why I called my book The Agenda to Erase America, is that that's precisely what it's about. When Ted Kennedy passed the 1965 Immigration Act and later penned the 1980 Refugee Act, his goal was to see America swamped with as many people from as many disparate cultures, poor cultures around the world as he possibly could. That guaranteed 2 things. It guaranteed, one, that we would have a huge and growing population of needy people who would require government benefits, something perfectly tailored for the Democrats to go out and purchase votes by providing them those benefits, and 2, to dilute the American culture to the point where it's unrecognizable, to the point where you and me, as red-blooded Americans, are just 2 people on the block among 8 or 10 others who are from all over the world and who could care less about the Constitution, could care less about the freedoms that we hold dear, could care less about the American dream and all of the things that go with it. They want the benefits, but they don't want the associated responsibilities. And the Democrats, it's a perfect recipe for them to amass power. Why? Because you have a population of needy people, and 2, those needy people will vote for you.
So you believe that the refugee problem is connected with this, but, the administration protests. It says, look, there's hardly any of these folk coming into the country. This is just all a bunch of hyperbole. there isn't really the influx that all the alarmists are saying. These are just a few thousand people. Is that an accurate description or not?
No. Once again, they mischaracterize the entire issue. And they're, as you know, Joe, they are very good at misdirection. Let's take the refugee program. First of all, the refugee program is one of many, many different legal immigration programs we have that bring in annually 1 million people a year from around the globe. Now, the historical immigration program sought to bring people who would like to come here because they wanted to pursue the American dream. They had to speak English, they had to have a job, and they had to prove that they were worth having here. This new paradigm considers that the United States owes them a living. The United States must provide for them whatever they need free of charge. And it goes along with the UN's agenda on resettlement, which was set in 1976. And the UN's agenda, which we are now seeing played out writ large in Europe, is to not merely redistribute income, but to redistribute populations around the world and take people from poor countries and move them into wealthy countries, as a means of redistributing those, so that they could share the benefits of the wealthy countries that they had not been able to before. And of course, it goes along with the whole socialist thing that, the wealthy countries are stealing the wealth from the poorer countries. And so rather than just redistributing income to the poorer countries, we just bring to the poor to the wealthy countries. But the fact of the matter is that the true agenda is much more malevolent. It is what I said. It is to destroy the culture, to suck up welfare resources, and to create a huge pool of voters that will allow the radical left to gain an unbeatable majority for the foreseeable future. And after that, we will see institution of despotic governments.
Answer this then. How does the discrimination against the Christian refugees play into all of this? Well, first, do you agree that there is actually discrimination that takes place against, for example, Syrian Christians as far as being part of the refugees that are introduced into the United States? And then second, how does that play into that agenda that you just described?
Well, first of all, as you know, the left's agenda is virulently anti-Christian. The left wants to see Christianity destroyed, and we can see that through their gay rights agenda. We can see that through their efforts to strip religion from the public square. Totally unconstitutional, by the way, although they claim they are using the Constitution as a separation of, the separation of church and state idea, which is not in the Constitution. But in Syria, in the last couple of years, well, actually, since 2003, we have let in about 2,300 Syrians. In the last 2 years, we've let in about 2,000. We've let in 53 Syrian Christians. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees picks most of the refugees. These are people who are settled in the refugee camps surrounding Syria, and they have to apply, but they have to be in those refugee camps. And the refugee camps are run by Muslims. And Christians won't go there because they're more afraid of being in the Muslim refugee camps than they are of being Syria. Consider that.
Wow.
They're stuck between a rock and a hard place. And so the UN High Commissioner has selected a few Christians, partially because they are biased against Christians, but also by the simple fact that the Christians are not in the refugee camps. They're afraid to go there.
Right. And yet the population is probably more targeted than any other. I mean, this is, of course, reflective also of what happened in Iraq with a vibrant Christian community that's almost gone. And, of course, now the directed hostility toward Christians in Syria is probably more pronounced than it was in Iraq. So I can only imagine as to the displacement and the numbers there that don't have anywhere to go now.
It's genocide against Christians. It is literally a genocide against Christians. Christians are the group that are most heavily persecuted in Syria and Iraq, as we know. They're the ones who are getting their heads chopped off. They're the ones who are being turned into sex slaves.
We're going to go to break here. I want to talk about, when we come back from break, a little bit about your proposal to stop the problem, at least with refugees. I mean, we aren't going to necessarily solve the whole crisis here, the motivated agenda. But let's talk about your proposed solution, what's on the table. Stay with us, The Joe Miller Show with Jim Simpson, investigative journalist. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KON Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. This show is made possible by the McPherson Tax Defense Group, 1-800-BEAT-IRS, beatirs.com, BEAT-IRS. We have with us Jim Simpson, investigative journalist, has been published broadly, Breitbart, Washington Times, Daily Caller, Accuracy and Media, WorldNet Daily, PJ Media, and your very own RestoringLiberty.com. He's an economist, businessman, has been on this program before, has worked in the White House Office of Management and Budget, and was featured in the Agenda documentary as well as the new Agenda 2. We were talking about, right before we went to break, the efforts to stop the refugee program, but Jim and I were talking a little bit right before we came back on, and he wanted to talk a little bit more about the different ways that refugees get in and how the Obama administration is playing games with numbers because it's not describing all these different categories. Jim, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, so, for example, the Obama administration said they're going to bring in 10,000 Syrians this coming year. They're going to bring in another 30,000 Syrians next year. Obama also said, not too many people caught it, excuse me, that he intended to use other programs to bring in as many more Syrians as he could because he's limited by the caps on the refugee program. And also he's limited by the fact that there's only so many refugees in the camps who have actually filled out forms to become refugees. That's what they have to do. They have to apply. And so what are some of these other programs? Well, there's something called humanitarian parole. There's something called temporary protected status. And both of these programs make it much easier for a Syrian to come in. All he needs to do is show up on the border, and the other one is asylum. And all these people need to do is show up on the border and say they're being oppressed and they're fleeing their homeland, and they have a much easier time getting entrance to the United States. If you are from a temporary protected status country, which Syria gained in 2012, Syria gained that status in 2012, all you need to do is show up in this country and say that you're from Syria, and you're in. You're an illegal alien, but you come to the Border Patrol or whoever it is, and you say, I'm from Syria, you are now here legally. So there are these other programs that are much less closely watched. And just to give you an idea of the numbers, we have had 2,300 Syrians come into the United States since 2003 through the Refugee Resettlement Program. We have had another 5,000 come in through temporary protected status, asylum, and those people bringing in their families and the parole program. So these other innovative programs, shall we call them, are bringing in more people. So when Obama says he's going to bring in 10,000 refugees, well, if the ratios hold, he's talking about 20 to 30,000 Syrians just this year. And next year, when he's bringing in 30,000 through the refugee program, how many more is he going to bring in through these other programs? The sky is the limit.
Just to make it clear, I mean, the review and the approval of these refugees, there's no assessment as to skills, talents, qualifications, right?
No, nope.
So, nope. I mean, a lot of these folks that come in here are just going to be dependent. And then, of course, the other issue is it only takes one to commit a terrorist act, and we're bringing in, tens of thousands.
Tens of thousands.
And we've heard the FBI doesn't even have time, according to their complaints, to do the sufficient background review, right?
Well, they can't do them because there's no database. They use the refugee program uses databases to vet refugees. And with countries with some kind of operating system where there's a way to track these people, then they can do it. But with failed states, Syria is a failed state, Somalia is another one, there's no way to really vet these people and find out who they are, find out what their connections are, find out if there's any nexus with terrorism. And it's interesting, you can't ask them about their political views. You can't ask them if they're Muslims or Christians. And if you're one of the voluntary refugee agencies that are paid billions of dollars by the U.S. government to resettle refugees, a lot of them are what they so-called religious organizations, and they say, oh, we're doing the Lord's work, we're going to proselytize and convert all these guys to Christianity. No, they're not. That's against the law. They're not allowed to proselytize.
So let's talk a little bit about the funding thing. We've only got a couple of minutes left here. I mean, you proposed, you supported an effort by Senator Sessions to limit funding or defund. I mean, that seems to be a no-brainer. That's what ought to be done, but of course we can never get the Congress to defund anything, it seems like. Tell us what the proposal is, whether or not you think it has any chance of succeeding.
Well, the only chance of stopping this juggernaut right now is through the funding mechanism. And we have a vote coming up on December 11th for another, what they call, omnibus bill, which will fund all of the government. They can't be bothered to do the individual appropriations anymore. They throw it all in one bill. Last year they gave Obama 100% of what he wanted. In fact, I think they gave him 110% of what he wanted. And this year they're going to try to do the same thing. But Senator Sessions has come forth and asked that an amendment be put on the omnibus bill that would defund the refugee resettlement program until they could get it under control again, because the whole thing is out of control. We don't have time to go into the problems that the refugee resettlement program has dumped, and countless small communities throughout the United States that are literally overwhelmed with people speaking dozens and dozens of different languages, who don't speak English, who can't do anything. It's just overwhelming communities. But so he wants to put an amendment that would defund refugee resettlement. What we need to do is get that idea supported in both the House and the Senate. And Brian Babin supports the idea. He said so in a letter to the leadership in the House that was signed by 74 of his fellow legislators. And so we hope against hope that the House will, for once, display a little bit of wisdom in the face of almost certain terrorist attacks if we bring in, as they're planning to, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of Syrians and people from other countries where we can't vet them, we don't know who they are, and we do know that they have already said what their intentions are for us.
Of course, more terrorist attacks, that means more control from government, more proposals for gun control, freedom, of course, always in target. And I think that's what's just absolutely despicable about this. I mean, I've said this before, that all these folk out there proposing more controls, more surveillance. It's like, do the smart thing first. Just shut down the borders. Right. Quit importing terrorists into the country. I mean, but that's not what they want to do. They want more control. That's what this whole scheme's about. Appreciate your efforts to uncover all that, Jim, the investigative work that you've done. We'll get this podcast up hopefully with one of your articles later today, and we'll have you back. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Stay with us, The Joe Miller Show. We'll have more right after this.